A pale morning settles over northern France in 1944. The sky is washed with mist, and the hum of an engine breaks the silence above the valley. A German reconnaissance pilot peers through his canopy, adjusting his goggles as sunlight glints across what seems to be a massive Allied formation below. Hundreds of Sherman tanks, lines of trucks, soldiers moving in rhythm. From his altitude, the invasion looks undeniable, a wall of steel stretching across farmland and forest. He radios it in immediately. Enemy division spotted, coordinates locked. The German High Command will be pleased. But as his message races through the airwaves, something strange happens below. One of the tanks folds, another deflates. The wind catches a canvas flank and ripples through it like a flag. Because down there, not one of those tanks is real. Hit subscribe and like the video. You won't want to miss what comes next. By the end of this story, you'll understand how a group of artists, sound engineers, and dreamers built an army out of thin air and fooled the German High Command itself. On the ground, the illusion breathes. Men in mud-splattered uniforms crouch beside enormous rubber shells, tugging ropes and inflating life-sized replicas of war machines. A young soldier with paint still on his hands from art school checks the angle of shadow under an inflatable jeep. Another adjusts the ropes that hold a Sherman tank upright as the air pump wheezes beside him. To the sky, they are warriors preparing for battle. In truth, they are stagehands in a play of war, every movement choreographed to deceive. The valley hums with life that does not exist. Microphones are buried in the dirt, their cords running back to massive loudspeakers camouflaged beneath tarps. At dusk, those speakers will roar to life, recordings of engine convoys and clanking treads echoing through the countryside, fooling any German patrol that passes near. From a distance, it will sound like an entire division is on the move. The Germans will adjust their positions, shift artillery, send scouts, and prepare to engage ghosts. A corporal wipes the sweat from his forehead and looks toward the horizon. He knows real soldiers are fighting not far away. Every hour they can mislead the enemy means lives saved across the river. There's a strange gravity to what they're doing, risking their lives, unarmed, for the sake of a lie. But to them, deception is duty. Each canvas tank, each sound effect, each false radio transmission becomes a weapon more powerful than any gun they could carry. Above, the German pilot banks his aircraft for another pass. He sees what he expects to see: columns of armor, tents, smoke from field kitchens. He sketches the outlines quickly in his notebook, circling them for command. But even from his high vantage point, he can't see the truth. He can't see that the soldiers below carry paintbrushes instead of rifles. He can't hear that the thunder of their engines comes from hidden speakers. He doesn't realize that the ground he's mapping holds no army at all. Night falls, and lanterns flicker through the mist. The air units are replaced with new inflatables. Painters crawl over the soft rubber hulls, brushing grime-colored streaks to make the fake tanks look battle-worn. Radio operators rehearse their transmissions, mimicking division chatter. Everything is designed for one purpose: to be believed, but never discovered. Somewhere nearby, a real infantry division prepares for a move under cover of darkness. Their safety depends on these illusions. The Ghost Army's work will draw the enemy's gaze, trick them into striking the wrong place at the wrong time. Every shadow painted, every tire track carved into the mud is part of a larger ballet of misdirection. War has become theater, and these men are its quiet performers. By dawn, the valley appears alive again. Rows of armor where none should be, movement where there is only air. The German High Command will wake to fresh reconnaissance photos and redirect its forces. For a few precious hours, deception will outweigh destruction, and the artists will disappear into the mist, leaving nothing behind but footprints and deflated ghosts. They laughed at the artists once, until they fooled Hitler's army. In the winter of 1943, inside a modest army office in Washington, D.C., a strange idea began to take shape. While generals planned battles and supply lines, a smaller group gathered around blueprints that had nothing to do with real tanks or artillery. They were sketching shadows, drafting the outlines of a phantom army. Intelligence officers, inspired by Britain's earlier deception at El Alamein, proposed something audacious: to build an entire U.S. division that would never truly exist. A formation made of air, paint, sound, and nerve. Its purpose was simple and dangerous: to mislead the German war machine, to become whatever army the Allies needed, wherever they needed it. They called it the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, activated on January 20th, 1944. Barely 1,100 men strong, it was one of the smallest units in the U.S. Army. And yet it carried the responsibility of tens of thousands. These weren't ordinary soldiers. Many came from art schools, advertising agencies, and design studios. Painters, set designers, sound technicians, architects, and radio operators, all sworn to secrecy, all trained to create illusions under fire. Among them was Bill Blass, who would one day become one of America's most celebrated fashion designers. Another, Ellsworth Kelly, would redefine modern art with his bold, abstract forms. Arthur Shilstone, Jack Macy, and Harold Lehner brought their brushes and sketchbooks into battle zones, recording their missions in watercolor and pencil. Sergeant Fred Fox chronicled it all, understanding even then that history might forget what couldn't be photographed. Their mission brief was unlike any other. They would impersonate entire divisions, move where real divisions were not, broadcast radio chatter that mimicked real commands, and make the Germans believe in armies that had no flesh or blood. It was theater, espionage, and engineering rolled into one. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. A single mistake, a poorly inflated tank, or a misplaced sound cue could expose them, inviting artillery fire or worse. Before shipping out, the men trained under the supervision of Colonel Harry L. Reeder and Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Ingersoll, both veterans of military intelligence. They studied the British deception playbook from North Africa, learning how dummy tanks and camouflage nets could redirect entire German corps. But the Americans took it further. They added art. They added sound. They added performance. Where the British had fooled Rommel with stationary decoys, the Americans planned to make their illusions move, breathe, and speak. At Camp Forest, Tennessee, their base became a laboratory for imagination. Rows of rubber tanks lined the fields, inflating and collapsing as soldiers tested new designs. Painters experimented with shading to make the decoys look heavy under sunlight. Radio specialists created fake signals that bounced across frequencies, confusing enemy listeners into thinking multiple divisions were on the move. Engineers built massive 500-pound speakers capable of projecting sound over 15 miles. An orchestra of engines, gears, and voices recorded by the Army Signal Corps. Even the men's mannerisms were rehearsed. They learned to walk, march, and act like the troops they were impersonating. If they posed as armored infantry, they carried themselves differently than artillerymen or engineers. Every role had a costume, every accent a detail. For them, survival depended on how convincing their theater of war could be. Yet, amid the drills and rehearsals, there was laughter. One artist joked that he'd joined the world's most dangerous art school. Another painted a cartoon on the side of a tent, a rubber tank deflating like a balloon, floating toward heaven. Beneath the humor, though, was tension. They all knew the illusion only worked as long as no one looked too closely. By the time they crossed the Atlantic in early 1944, the Ghost Army was ready, not to fight, but to perform. Their canvas was Europe. Their script would change with each campaign. Normandy, Luxembourg, the Ardennes, Germany. Wherever deception could save lives, they would set the stage and vanish before dawn. In a war defined by firepower, they were proof that imagination could be its own weapon. Their weapons arrived in crates that looked unassuming. Rolls of rubber, stacks of canvas, reels of tape, and boxes of recording wire. But for the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, these were tools of warfare as vital as rifles or shells. They would build an army from the ground up, and they would do it in hours. In the muddy fields of France, they began their work. Air compressors hissed as inflatable Sherman tanks rose slowly from the earth, the rubber skin glistening under the morning light. Within 30 minutes, a patch of empty farmland transformed into what looked like a full armored column. Each tank was detailed with paint and mud stains to appear battle-worn. From a distance, or from the lens of a German reconnaissance plane, it was indistinguishable from the real thing. Nearby, sound engineers unpacked the next layer of illusion, the sonic deception. They mounted enormous 500-pound speakers onto trucks and pointed them across the valleys. From those speakers came a low, rumbling thunder, recordings of tank convoys, engines revving, chains clattering, boots striking dirt. The noise could be heard 15 miles away, echoing through the landscape like a ghostly march. At night, when visibility dropped, the deception became perfect. To any German soldier listening from afar, a massive American division was on the move. Then came the radio operators, the unseen voices of invisible armies. They set up mobile transmitters and began broadcasting fake chatter. The messages were scripted, rehearsed, and sent in the precise codes of real units. Each operator adopted a call sign and persona, carefully mimicking tone, slang, and command patterns. The Germans, who monitored Allied frequencies obsessively, would intercept these transmissions and believe them genuine. The operators even synchronized their signals with fake troop movements on the ground, creating an auditory map that matched the illusion perfectly. The painters were the final magicians. Their craft went beyond camouflage. They designed entire landscapes of deceit. Fake tire tracks carved into mud, false shadows painted along roads, dummies draped in nets that caught the sun just right. From overhead, it looked alive. The sprawl of tents, supply trucks, mess halls, and the orderly geometry of a division preparing for battle. But up close, it was theater, a set piece on the edge of war. At night, the camp flickered with life. Fires were lit. Music drifted faintly from a gramophone. Soldiers, artists really, moved through the shadows, adjusting tanks, staging headlights, repositioning decoys so the illusion changed with each dawn. From afar, the rhythm of a living army pulsed through the fields. But when morning broke, the real troops would already be miles away, and the Ghost Army would deflate its creations, pack them into trucks, and vanish like mist. Sometimes their timing was so precise that even Allied pilots were fooled. One airman flying overhead marked the location of the armored division in his log before realizing later it had never existed. The artistry was that convincing. The soldiers joked that they should earn acting credits instead of medals, but it wasn't comedy. It was precision. Every movement, every sound, every brush stroke was calculated to manipulate perception. The Germans depended heavily on aerial reconnaissance and intercepted radio traffic. The Ghost Army turned that dependency into a weapon. In one experiment, they inflated an entire convoy of trucks overnight and left false tire marks leading to a non-existent supply depot. German scouts discovered it the next morning and reported a new logistical base, prompting Luftwaffe bombers to waste precious fuel attacking an empty field. Another time, the sound team mimicked the noise of tanks crossing a bridge, forcing enemy engineers to destroy a nearby crossing preemptively, crippling their own retreat route. The unit's motto wasn't written anywhere, but everyone knew it. If you can't beat them with bullets, confuse them with brilliance. What they built wasn't an army of men. It was an army of ghosts, conjured from air, paint, and sound. Each illusion bought the Allies time, saved real lives, and turned the battlefield into a canvas of controlled chaos. In a war measured by destruction, their victories were measured by what never happened, the battles that never took place, the soldiers who never had to die. March 1945. The Rhine River shimmered under a dull gray sky, swollen with spring thaw and war debris. Across its far bank, German forces prepared for the inevitable Allied crossing, the last great barrier before the heart of Germany. The High Command knew the Americans would strike soon. What they didn't know was where. That uncertainty was all the Ghost Army needed. For weeks, the real Ninth Army had been secretly moving south, preparing to cross near Wesel. Their success depended on one thing: keeping the Germans distracted somewhere else. And so, the artists, engineers, and sound men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops rolled into the fields near Viersen, 20 miles north, to stage their masterpiece. It began quietly. Trucks arrived under cover of darkness, headlights blacked out, engines muted. The men moved like stagehands before opening night, unloading air pumps, loudspeakers, and coiled radio cables into the wet grass. As dawn broke, their empty field began to swell with life. Within hours, rows of inflatable Sherman tanks filled the horizon, artillery lined the ditches, and wooden antenna towers reached into the mist. From a distance, Viersen looked like a stronghold bristling with American might. Then came the sound. The sonic unit positioned its 500-pound speakers across the valley, broadcasting recordings of tanks, bulldozers, and men shouting commands. The roar echoed for miles, bouncing off riverbanks and forest ridges. To German scouts, it was unmistakable. The Americans were building up for a major assault. By midday, the radio deception team took over. Their transmitters hummed to life, imitating the chatter of the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. They sent messages about bridge construction, troop readiness, and ammunition counts, every detail carefully crafted to match authentic Army code and style. The Germans intercepted the transmissions and acted fast, shifting artillery batteries north toward the phantom threat. Meanwhile, local civilians, many forced by the Nazis to report military activity, watched the valley fill with tanks and trucks. They described what they saw to German officers: thousands of troops, supply convoys, even field kitchens cooking hot meals. It was confirmation from the ground that the Americans were indeed massing near Viersen. The deception was perfect. Under the cover of this illusion, miles away, the real U.S. divisions crossed the Rhine with minimal resistance. The Germans, misled by art and sound, fired their shells into empty fields. For every explosion that tore through the rubber hull of a dummy tank, hundreds of real soldiers elsewhere marched safely across the river. But even in success, the Ghost Army faced danger. Enemy scouts crept close at night, and artillery sometimes found its mark. The men worked fast, inflating and repositioning decoys between barrages. Some slept in shallow trenches beside their creations, surrounded by the hiss of air compressors and the low rumble of recorded engines. They were soldiers without weapons, fighting a battle of perception that could kill them all the same. One private later recalled how a German spotter plane passed overhead just as he was painting mud streaks on a dummy Sherman. He froze, brush in hand, as the plane circled twice before flying off. They'd done it. The illusion held. To the enemy above, it was all real. When the real divisions finally secured their foothold across the Rhine, the Ghost Army quietly deflated its army. Tanks collapsed into heaps of rubber, and the field that had looked like a fortress the day before turned into an empty pasture once again. The men packed up their tools, their sound gear, their radios, and disappeared before sunrise. The Germans never realized they had fought shadows. Reports intercepted days later confirmed that entire battalions had been diverted to defend the wrong sector. Eisenhower's staff later called Operation Viersen one of the most successful deception efforts of the European campaign. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops didn't fire a single shot, but their illusions had carried real weight measured in lives spared and days gained. In the fields near Viersen, where tanks once inflated and deflated like lungs, the war had briefly become a stage, and the actors had played their parts to perfection. They lived close to danger, closer than anyone outside their circle would ever know. The Ghost Army didn't sit comfortably behind the lines. They often worked within artillery range, bait for the enemy's guns. They were dressed like soldiers, but most were unarmed. Their job required them to look like the spearhead of an invasion, even if it meant standing in a field full of rubber tanks with real shells whistling overhead. In France, Belgium, and later Germany, they learned quickly that illusions came with consequences. When the ruse worked too well, the enemy struck back hard. Once, after setting up a decoy artillery battery, the men were eating rations by their tents when the first German shells landed nearby. The sky ripped open. They dove for cover, realizing their art had succeeded too perfectly. The Germans believed they were the front line. One man later joked that it was the only time in history someone nearly died for bad painting, but the laughter didn't hide the fear. They knew every mission could end in silence and smoke. In Luxembourg, another team inflated dummy vehicles under cover of darkness. By dawn, enemy spotters reported a new armored formation in the woods, and German artillery opened fire. One blast tore through the decoy camp, shredding tents and bursting tanks like balloons. When the smoke cleared, several Ghost Army men were gone. Artists turned soldiers turned ghosts for real. Their comrades buried them quietly, their work unrecognized, their mission classified. There were times when the Germans got too close. Patrols stumbled upon fake camps, forcing the men to bluff their way out. They dressed sentries in clean uniforms, armed with empty rifles, and positioned them near roads to look convincing. If enemy scouts approached, those sentries stood tall and motionless, praying the deception held. Sometimes it did. Other times, it meant a firefight they couldn't win. The danger wasn't only physical, it was moral. Pretending to be an army meant luring the enemy's attention onto themselves. The Ghost Army drew artillery, gunfire, and air raids away from real divisions. That was the point. But every time a shell screamed overhead, every time a bomb exploded nearby, the men felt the weight of their chosen disguise. They were the bait, standing between life and death so others could pass unseen. Some wrote about it later with quiet humor. "We were like matadors," one said. "Our job was to get the bull's attention and hope we stepped aside in time." Others admitted that, Despite the risk, there was a strange satisfaction in outsmarting an enemy that outgunned them 100 to 1. It was intellect against instinct, wit against war. They operated under a simple rule: never get caught. If the Germans realized the deception, it could unravel entire operations. To maintain the illusion, the men rehearsed their roles endlessly, marching in formation, setting up campfires, even swapping unit patches so they looked like different divisions from week to week. Some carried fake paperwork, ready to hand over if questioned. They were actors, soldiers, and spies rolled into one. In the rare moments of quiet, they would gather around their makeshift mess halls, artists and engineers, radio men and stage designers, eating from tin trays and sketching the war around them. Some drew the landscapes they were trying to imitate. Others painted the faces of villagers or the silhouette of a ruined church. Their art became both record and release, a fragile beauty amid destruction. And still, they went back out each time the call came. Inflate, paint, broadcast, deceive. They repeated it until it became muscle memory. The Ghost Army didn't fire bullets, but they faced the same risks as those who did. In the fog and flash of Europe's final year of war, they were soldiers made of imagination and courage, fighting an invisible battle where victory meant surviving unseen. One veteran said it simply, years later: "We weren't heroes with guns. We were bait with brains." When the war finally ended, the men of the Ghost Army went home quietly. No parades, no medals, no stories told at the bar. Their families never knew where they'd been or what they'd done. Officially, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops didn't exist. Their operations, all 20 of them across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany, were sealed away under military secrecy, hidden behind layers of classified files that would not see daylight for half a century. For decades, they lived ordinary lives among ordinary people, carrying a secret that had once saved thousands. Bill Blass designed clothes that walked the runways of New York. Ellsworth Kelly painted vast color fields that hung in museums. Arthur Shilstone became a commercial artist, illustrating magazine covers and children's books. Harold Lehner taught art to new generations. But behind every brushstroke, every design, was the quiet echo of those strange days when they painted tanks instead of canvases and turned sound into a weapon. When they gathered at reunions, the stories resurfaced. One would laugh about the time an inflatable tank rolled down a hill when the wind picked up. Another remembered painting fake shadows on a road while shells exploded in the distance. They had risked their lives to create illusions, and for years, nobody outside their circle believed them. The files were sealed, the missions unacknowledged. When they tried to explain, even their loved ones thought it sounded like a myth. It wasn't until 1996 that the truth finally began to emerge. Declassification brought their story to light. Reports, sketches, and photographs that confirmed the impossible: that a handful of artists had deceived the German army again and again. The world finally learned that this tiny band of illusionists had fought a different kind of war, one waged with air hoses, paintbrushes, and turntables instead of bullets. Documentaries followed. Books were written. Museums displayed their artifacts: rubber tank segments, faded maps, and the weathered sketchbooks that had once been too dangerous to show. Veterans, now gray-haired and stooped, stood before their old creations and smiled. One said softly, "We fooled the Germans, and then we fooled history." We were invisible twice, but beneath the pride was something gentler, an awareness that their greatest victory had been anonymity. The men of the Ghost Army had built illusions so convincing that they had not only deceived the enemy, but vanished from memory themselves. For 50 years, they carried that silence with discipline and humility. Then, in 2022, their secret finally reached the halls of Congress. Surviving members were honored with the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest distinctions. Families of those long gone accepted on their behalf. At the ceremony, officials spoke of courage and creativity, of soldiers who fought not with violence, but with vision. The audience applauded, and for the first time, the ghosts stepped into the light. Fred Fox's old journal was read aloud. His words still resonated across the decades. The work we did was a strange kind of warfare. We fought without killing, risked everything without firing a shot. For those who had lived half their lives unable to speak of it, the recognition was bittersweet. Their war had been one of silence, their memories trapped in classified vaults. Now, as their stories resurfaced, it was as though the illusions they had once created were dissolving for the last time, revealing not deception, but devotion. The men who once conjured armies from air had grown old. But in the quiet of that ceremony, surrounded by photographs of their long-lost creations, they were soldiers again. Painters and engineers who had once held the line with nothing but imagination. Their secret war was finally over. The world they left behind was shaped by their unseen hands. Though their missions ended in 1945, their influence seeped into every corner of modern military strategy. The art of deception they had refined, visual, sonic, and psychological, became a permanent part of warfare's new language. When the Cold War began, their techniques resurfaced under new names: camouflage, misdirection, psychological operations. What the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had improvised with paint and air became the foundation for entire departments of military science. Radios once used to broadcast fake chatter evolved into electronic warfare systems. Inflatable tanks inspired decoys used from Vietnam to the Gulf War. The sonic deception of the Ghost Army laid groundwork for future sound-based warfare experiments, manipulating the battlefield through audio illusion. Historians and tacticians studied their work as a case study in ingenuity. Military academies dissected their operations, fascinated by the precision with which art and science had merged under fire. But beyond tactics and technology, their story carried something deeper: a philosophy that imagination could outthink aggression, that deception could preserve life instead of destroying it. In interviews late in life, surviving members spoke with quiet humor about the irony of their legacy. "We made noise to create silence," one said. "We built tanks so the real ones wouldn't have to fight." Their creativity had turned the tools of destruction into instruments of protection. It was a strange inversion of war itself: art not as escape, but as armor. Their motto, unofficial, unspoken, lingered across generations: "Our weapons were imagination." Those words appeared later in museums, etched beside faded photographs and cracked air pumps. They captured the paradox perfectly. In a world tearing itself apart with technology, the Ghost Army had fought using the oldest human tools of all: illusion, storytelling, and empathy. Artists like Ellsworth Kelly would later describe how the discipline of camouflage, the study of shadow, color, and perception shaped his art. Bill Blass often joked that his career in fashion was just another kind of disguise. To them, deception had never been about lies. It was about seeing differently, about bending reality to protect it. Their influence reached beyond the battlefield. In intelligence circles, their success sparked the birth of psychological operations, methods of persuasion, deterrence, and misinformation that continue in subtle forms to this day. Governments learned that what people believe can shape what armies do. The Ghost Army had proven that an idea, invisible and weightless, could move divisions and rewrite maps. Even outside the military, their legacy endured in unexpected ways. Filmmakers studied their illusion-making techniques for special effects. Architects borrowed their understanding of perspective and disguise. Artists invoked their story as proof that creativity could triumph in the bleakest of times. Decades later, when new generations discovered their story, the reaction was disbelief mixed with awe. How could 1,100 men change the course of a world war without firing a shot? The answer lay in their restraint. They understood something few others did, that the sharpest minds often leave the quietest footprints. The men of the Ghost Army never sought glory. They weren't remembered for medals or monuments, but for an idea that imagination itself could be a weapon of mercy. Their art didn't just mislead the enemy. It reminded the world that even amid destruction, creation still had power. And so their story closes not with an explosion, but with a whisper. Somewhere in a museum drawer lies a faded sketch of an inflatable tank, its edges worn and smudged with paint. Beneath it, a caption reads, "They painted an army into existence and fooled the German High Command itself. That was their war, and that was their masterpiece." In the years that followed, their story passed quietly into history, tucked between the famous battles and grand strategies that defined the Second World War. But for those who truly studied the war's deeper layers, the Ghost Army remained something rare, proof that intellect and imagination could save lives on a scale no bomb ever could. They were men who had built illusions, but what lingered wasn't illusion, it was legacy. The soldiers they saved never knew their names. The commanders who benefited from their deception rarely met them. Yet, in those hidden fields across France and Germany, their work shifted the course of battles, buying hours and days that shaped the end of the war. The idea that art could alter destiny sounds romantic, almost impossible. But the Ghost Army had made it real. They turned sketches into shields, melodies into misdirection, and laughter into survival. What began as an experiment in deception had become a triumph of creativity over chaos. As time went on, their story inspired those who came after. Artists, engineers, and soldiers alike found meaning in their quiet defiance. To make war safer through illusion, to build something instead of destroy, was a kind of heroism the world rarely recognized. It wasn't the loud kind that filled parades or adorned medals. It was the silent kind that slipped away before dawn, leaving only footprints and echoes behind. One surviving member once said that the hardest part wasn't keeping the secret. It was realizing that nobody would ever understand the kind of courage it took to fight without violence. To stand unarmed under shellfire, to risk death not by killing but by pretending, required a conviction almost beyond comprehension. It was a paradox that defined them, warriors who fought by refusing to fight. Their story, when finally told, offered a mirror to humanity's dual nature. War reveals how destructive humans can be, but the Ghost Army revealed the opposite, how inventive, resourceful, and compassionate people can become even in the midst of destruction. They showed that survival sometimes depends not on strength or weapons, but on the fragile power of belief. As the last of them passed on, their sketches, letters, and faded photographs remained, testimonies of an invisible war fought with humor and grace. The faces in those pictures look young, almost too young for the burden they carried. But their eyes tell the truth. They knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't tricksters. They were guardians disguised as ghosts. In the end, their victory was quiet. There were no marching bands, no headlines, no monuments towering above the cities they'd helped liberate. Only the knowledge that their lies had saved lives and that their illusions had become one of the truest acts of courage the war would ever know. The fog has long lifted from the valleys of France. The rubber tanks are gone, the loudspeakers silent, the fake roads washed away by rain. But somewhere, in the faint hum of a museum projector or the pages of an old diary, the ghosts return, reminding us that sometimes the greatest acts of war are the ones that leave no trace. They painted an army into existence and fooled the German high command itself. They are gone now, the men who painted tanks and stitched sound into war, but their ghosts remain, not in superstition, but in legacy. Across Europe, the fields where they once built their illusions have returned to silence. Grass grows where rubber armor once stood. The wind hums through the valleys they once filled with recorded engines and phantom battalions. Nothing is left to see, yet something invisible lingers, as though the ground still remembers the men who made deception an act of courage. History rarely honors those who worked in shadows. The Ghost Army never sought it. Their victories couldn't be measured in cities captured or enemies killed, but in the quiet arithmetic of lives spared. For every German shell fired at a rubber tank, a real soldier lived to see another sunrise. For every false transmission, an ambush was avoided. Their art bent the trajectory of death itself. They belonged to no myth, no legend, just a small group of dreamers who turned imagination into armor. Their sketches and soundscapes changed the shape of the war not through destruction, but through creation. They proved that courage isn't always loud, and genius doesn't always stand in the light. Sometimes it hides behind a canvas tent, whispering through a radio signal, echoing in the rumble of a recorded tank engine that never existed. When the records were finally opened, the truth felt almost cinematic. Historians read the mission reports, saw the photographs, and struggled to believe that something so improbable had actually happened. How could 1,100 men have tricked one of the most powerful armies on Earth? The answer, like their story, was disarmingly simple. They understood that war, at its core, is perception, and they mastered the art of controlling it. Decades later, as the world grew more digital, more virtual, their work felt prophetic. They had created illusions long before computers, built simulations without screens, and fought a psychological war decades ahead of its time. What they achieved with fabric and air has since become the foundation of modern deception. Cyber operations, misinformation, camouflage in every form. But where today's warfare manipulates truth for power, theirs did it for mercy. If you visit the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, you might find one of their old inflatables, stitched seams, faded paint, quiet dignity. Nearby, in a glass case, a simple sketch, a soldier painting a shadow beneath a fake tank. Beneath it reads a single line. He painted the illusion that saved 1,000 men. Their story ends as it began, in silence. A few surviving letters, a handful of recordings, a truth almost too human to fit inside history's statistics. They never claimed to be heroes. They never called themselves artists. They were simply men asked to make the impossible believable, and they did. When we remember the Second World War, we think of thunder, the roar of engines, the crack of artillery, the chaos of victory. But hidden beneath that thunder was a whisper, the whisper of air pumps inflating tanks in the night, the whisper of radios faking entire armies, the whisper of men who fought with illusion so others wouldn't have to fight at all. They painted an army into existence and fooled the German high command itself.